In August 1945, the guns fell silent across the globe. For millions of American service members stationed across Europe, North Africa, India, and the vast expanse of the Pacific, the war was finally over. But their immediate reaction was not celebration. It was a singular pressing question: how do we get home? More than 8 million Americans were stranded thousands of miles from home. Their uniforms were worn, their deployment points were isolated, and the public back in the United States made a demand that brooked no argument. Bring the boys home by Christmas. Military planners faced a terrifying logistical paradox. They had spent 4 years building the greatest killing machine in human history to push across oceans. Now they had to turn that exact same machine around and run it in reverse, at double the speed, with a population that was completely done fighting. Before the Japanese surrender in August 1945, the War Department had calculated that demobilization would be a gradual, methodical process. General George Marshall and his staff assumed the war in the Pacific would grind on well into 1946. Under their original blueprints, troops would be released in carefully measured increments over a period of 2 years. This pacing was designed to maintain occupation forces in Germany and Japan, while avoiding a sudden shock to the domestic labor market. The abrupt atomic bombings and the immediate surrender of Japan shattered those assumptions overnight. The multi-year timeline compressed into a matter of weeks. The military was no longer managing a controlled drawdown. They were standing at the center of a human pressure cooker. Politicians in Washington were flooded with telegrams from anxious families, church groups, and veterans organizations. The message was uniform: the enemy had surrendered. Therefore, keeping soldiers overseas was no longer military necessity, but institutional inertia. The problem was not a lack of willingness. It was pure geography and iron physics. The United States military had mastered the art of projecting power outward, building forward bases, and supplying armies on distant shores. However, bringing millions of people back across oceans required a totally different infrastructure. Commercial passenger liners, which traditionally handled transatlantic migration, had been requisitioned years earlier. Many were troop ships already crammed with military equipment or sitting at the bottom of the ocean. In the Pacific theater, the distances were staggering. A single round trip between San Francisco and Manila took a standard transport ship nearly a month. Thousands of islands held small garrisons that could not simply be abandoned, yet did not warrant large convoys. Furthermore, the ships themselves were wearing out. Engines that had run continuously for years without proper overhaul were strained to their thermal limits. Boiler tubes cracked, hulls fouled with barnacles, and electrical systems failed under the tropical heat. Faced with a catastrophic shortfall of transport vessels, the U.S. Navy made a radical administrative decision. They threw out the rulebook of naval warfare and turned their most lethal combat assets into passenger ferries. Aircraft carriers, the very ships that had won the war in the Pacific, became the backbone of Operation Magic Carpet. Flight decks were cleared of aircraft. Inside the massive steel hangars, shipyard workers welded thousands of tiered pipe bunks, packed tightly together in rows reminiscent of cargo holds. Battleships and heavy cruisers were stripped of their secondary ammunition stores and redeployed. A standard fleet carrier could suddenly swallow up to 4,000 passengers in a single voyage. This conversion required immense logistical gymnastics. Water distillation plants ran around the clock to supply thousands of men on ships designed for smaller crews. Mess decks that normally served single shifts now operated 24 hours a day, feeding men in continuous rotations. Operation Magic Carpet was effectively split into 2 entirely different campaigns, driven by the geography of the respective oceans. In the Atlantic, the journey was shorter, but the numbers were massive. Millions of troops stationed across the European theater funneled through French and British ports. Here, the workhorse vessels were Liberty ships and Victory ships, augmented by captured German liners and surviving passenger ships like the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mary alone could carry over 15,000 troops per crossing, cutting through the North Atlantic waves at high speeds that made her virtually immune to lingering submarine threats. In the Pacific, the environment was punishingly different. Troops waited in sweltering tent cities across the Philippines, Okinawa, and the Marianas. Typhoon season routinely battered staging ports, delaying sailings and adding weeks of misery to men who had already survived combat. Life aboard these makeshift passenger ships was far from luxurious. Thousands of men lived in dim, poorly ventilated hangar bays where the air smelled of diesel exhaust, salt spray, and stale coffee. Hammocks and bunks were stacked 4 or 5 tiers high. Sanitation facilities were overwhelmed, leading to strict rationing of fresh water. Men spent weeks playing endless card games, reading tattered paperbacks, and staring out at an endless horizon. Behind this logistical strain was the adjusted service rating system, commonly known as the point system. Points were awarded based on length of service, time overseas, combat decorations, and whether a soldier had children. Men calculated their points down to the single digit. When high-point veterans saw lower-point replacements arriving to take garrison duties while they remained stranded, frustration boiled over. In late 1945, unauthorized protests and rallies broke out in Manila and parts of Europe. Despite the friction, the numbers moving through the system were unprecedented. By the winter of 1945, Operation Magic Carpet was operating at a breathtaking tempo. During the peak months of November and December 1945, more than 700,000 service members were brought home every single month. Ships docked around the clock at East Coast and West Coast ports. Harbor workers, port authorities, and railway operators formed an intricate domestic relay. As soon as a troopship tied up at San Francisco or New York, engineers cleared the gangways, loaded men onto waiting troop trains, and dispatched them toward regional separation centers. Civilian rail networks, which had endured 4 years of heavy wartime wear, coordinated thousands of special passenger trains to carry veterans across state lines toward hometowns they had not seen in years. The arrival ports became emotional checkpoints for the entire nation. New York Harbor, Seattle, and Los Angeles greeted battered gray warships flying long homecoming pennants from their mastheads. Red Cross volunteers handed out coffee, donuts, and cigarettes. Local municipal bands played swing music on docks crowded with waiting families, yet the transition was rarely seamless. Millions of young men stepped off trains into a civilian economy that was rapidly restructuring. Housing shortages were acute, and universities overflowed with veterans utilizing the newly enacted GI Bill. When Operation Magic Carpet officially wound down in September 1946, the final tally stunned even the optimists. Over 8 million American service members had been transported across oceans in little over a year. Most popular histories of World War II focus on the dramatic offensives, the amphibious landings, and the grand strategy of victory. They treat demobilization as a natural footnote that followed the surrender documents. Yet Operation Magic Carpet reveals that winning a global war required more than tactical brilliance on the battlefield. It required an institutional capacity so vast that an entire global armada could be instantly reversed to carry an army back across the world. The true measure of America's wartime industrial power was not just how fast it could send men into the fire, but how safely it could bring them home when the ashes cooled.